Boa noite. Ele é um dos mais importantes pensadores deste final de século. No centro do Roda Viva está o professor americano Noam Chomsky.
Anos 60, tempo de paz, amor e uma revolução de costumes. Como contraste, o confronto entre Estados Unidos e União Soviética na Baía dos Porcos, em Cuba, a Guerra do Vietnã. E é neste cenário que, no início da década, sai do anonimato o linguista Noam Chomsky. E com ele, a teoria de uma gramática universal, já presente no código genético que ordena a fala do ser humano, relegando a língua a uma mera questão cultural. A ideia provoca um rebuliço na comunidade científica. A polêmica incentiva Noam Chomsky a expor sua visão política. Suas críticas contra a Guerra do Vietnã chamam a atenção. Começava aí um caminho sem volta contra qualquer modelo de poder, do comunismo ao liberalismo totalitário norte-americano. Outro alvo de ataque é a mídia de massa. Chomsky trata as grandes redes de comunicação como veículos manipuladores a serviço de quem ele considera os verdadeiros donos de governos e nações, os grandes conglomerados multinacionais. Decifrar a história por trás da mídia é um dos passatempos favoritos desse anarquista confesso. Em Repensando Camelot, um dos seus mais de 50 livros, o filósofo estarrece os leitores com uma interpretação reveladora. Arranca a máscara pacifista do ex-presidente John Kennedy e apresenta JFK como um dos mentores da invasão de Cuba e articulador da guerra contra o Vietnã e dos golpes no Chile e no Brasil. Chomsky é filho de judeus. O interesse pela linguística herdou do pai, um erudito em hebraico. Aos 32 anos, Chomsky se tornou catedrático do Instituto de Tecnologia de Massachusetts, um dos mais prestigiados centros de pesquisas do mundo. Hoje, aos 68 anos, é considerado um dos maiores intelectuais de esquerda e um crítico ferrenho das atuais políticas interna e externa dos Estados Unidos. Mesmo de origem judaica, é uma voz dissonante ao atacar a política israelense e se posicionar em favor de um Estado palestino. A perspectiva de Chomsky para a virada do século é um balde de água fria nos apóstolos da globalização. Para ele, a eliminação das culturas regionais e a interferência de instrumentos de poder, como o FMI, o Banco Mundial e o NAFTA, funcionarão como geradores de pobreza, aumentando os problemas de distribuição de renda em favor das elites.
Bem, para entrevistar o pensador Noam Chomsky, nós convidamos essa noite o Alberto, do Laboratório de Estudos Avançados de Jornalismo da Unicamp, o Ibsen Costa Manso, que é secretário assistente do Jornal da Tarde, o jornalista Sergio Augusto, dos jornais O Globo e o Estado de São Paulo, o Daniel Piza, editor de cultura da Gazeta Mercantil, o Breno, diretor de redação da revista Atenção, o Emir, que é cientista político, e o Ibsen Spartacus, diretor editorial da Nova Cultural. O Roda Viva é transmitido em rede nacional com 150 outras emissoras de 21 estados brasileiros. Infelizmente, como esse programa foi gravado, nós não estamos recebendo as perguntas e a participação do telespectador. Boa noite, professor Noam Chomsky.
How are you?
Eu gostaria de começar esse programa do início, ou seja, o senhor ficou conhecido no início como um estudioso dos fenômenos da linguagem. E, a partir de um certo momento, o senhor passou também a fazer uma intervenção política. A partir de quando o senhor sentiu necessidade de interferir na questão política?
Well, actually, my first political article that I recall was when I was 10 years old in the school newspaper after the fall of Barcelona. I was very much interested in the Spanish Civil War, becoming involved at that time with left libertarian groups concerned about the spread of fascism in Europe. at whatever level a 10-year-old understands such things, and nothing much has changed since. So it's not first linguistics and then politics. That was long before I had heard that there was such a thing as linguistics or the study of language.
Professor Emir, por favor.
Professor Chomsky, terminada a chamada Guerra Fria e os conflitos entre Estados Unidos e União Soviética, segundo o professor Samuel Huntington, a dinâmica dos conflitos contemporâneos se daria ao nível das civilizações, ao nível das culturas. Na verdade, a cultura ocidental contra o resto das culturas. É um artigo famoso, seguiu a trajetória do Fukuyama, primeiro artigo do Foreign Affairs, depois um livro. Segundo Kissinger, é o livro mais importante desde o começo da Guerra Fria. Queria saber que opinião o senhor tem a respeito dessa concepção.
I do not have a very high opinion of most of the work of respected intellectuals. I have to admit that. They have a job to do, which is to make things seem complicated and to present a picture of the world that will serve their interests and serve power interests. The end of history has been declared at least a half a dozen times in the last 130 years, always wrongly. I think the Cold War was seriously misinterpreted. In my view, it was a phase of what's called the North-South conflict, sort of a euphemism for the European conquest of the world. The Eastern Europe was the original Third World back as far as the 15th century. When it began to move towards independence in 1917, it evoked essentially the same reaction that was evoked when, at the opposite extreme, Grenada began setting up fishing cooperatives. Well, the scale is radically different, and it took on a life of its own. But this basic structure of it is within that framework, and so things continue. What Professor Huntington calls the clash of civilizations has been going on forever. It's going on in approximately the same way today. His idea that the United States is somehow, the United States, the leader of the West, is confronting an Islamic civilization, it makes no sense. One of the closest allies of the United States is perhaps the most fundamentalist Islamic country in the world, Saudi Arabia. That could change tomorrow if there was a revolution in Saudi Arabia. The dynamics and the processes are about as they have been before. In fact, it's very striking in the case of the United States. Since 1917, every U.S. intervention, particularly since 1945, has been justified on the grounds of concern over, the Soviet danger. But what happened right before the Cold War, which really broke out in 1917, immediately before Woodrow Wilson invaded Haiti and the Dominican Republic? That wasn't in defense against the Soviet Union, obviously. It was in defense against the Huns. Before that, it was in defense against someone else. In fact, if you look at the development of the U.S. Navy 100 years ago, it was in defense against Chile, believe it or not. And U.S. warships were off the coast of Chile. Immediately after the fall of the Berlin Wall, what happened? A few weeks later, the United States invaded Panama. It was so conventional that it's hardly a footnote in history. In fact, about the only difference between that and preceding interventions for many years was that they had to have new pretexts. It couldn't be in defense against the Soviet Union, so it was in defense against Hispanic narco-traffickers. Next time it'll be something else. If you look at the conflicts that are now raging around the world, most of them have been there for a long time. In fact, about the only ones that are new are those that are within the collapsing Soviet empire. So Chechnya, that's new. But that's the result of the breakdown of every imperial system. When the Portuguese Empire collapsed, there were huge conflicts still going on, in fact, in the Portuguese colonial system, Angola, Mozambique, Timor, in Southeast Asia. When the French and British colonial systems collapsed, there were huge massacres and slaughters and conflicts, some still continuing. The ones in Central Africa right now are residues of German and first Belgian, then German, later French imperialism. There are always new things happening, but the fundamental dynamics I don't think have changed substantially, in fact, for a long, long time.
Professor Chomsky.
Professor. Fazendo um pouco, aproveitando a sua biografia, já que estamos no início do programa, o senhor foi educado numa família de forte tradição cultural, pelo menos judaica, uma família, inclusive, progressista, onde as notícias da guerra de Espanha entravam dentro de casa. Como é que o senhor vê dois problemas ligados à sua formação? No próximo ano nós vamos ter o primeiro século de existência do sionismo político. Qual é o futuro que vê para o Estado de Israel? E qual é o futuro que vê para o judaísmo na diáspora? Religião, cultura apenas, uma ideia moral e ética? Eu queria que o senhor elaborasse um pouco sobre essas duas questões.
Yes, my parents were first-generation immigrants from Eastern Europe and very deeply involved in the Jewish community, in fact, lived in what was almost a kind of cultural ghetto. At the same time, they were New Deal liberals, Roosevelt liberals. You know, that was basically the politics. Other parts of the family to which I was drawn very early were working class, mostly unemployed. It was the late 1930s. A very lively intellectual culture. There was a very rich, lively intellectual culture at the time, and I mean high culture, so latest debates about psychoanalysis and Marx and the Budapest String Quartet and so on and so forth. Many of them had almost no education, but there was a rich cultural tradition, and I was part of that. So it's a mixture of Jewish, very heavy Jewish involvement through my whole life, and also that. At the time, I was what was called a Zionist. In fact, most of my activism in those years, in my teens, was Zionist, but opposed to a Jewish state, because that was part of the Zionist movement at the time. There are many illusions about this. The first official commitment of the Zionist movement to a Jewish state was actually in 1942 in the United States. Before that, it included within it strong binationalist tendencies, even including the leadership like David Ben-Gurion and others. And it was a kind of I was part of a radical socialist wing which was committed to Arab-Jewish working-class cooperation. Maybe it was an illusion, maybe it was real, one could debate that, but anyway, that was the commitment, and so it remained. I lived in a kibbutz for a while, in fact, in Israel, and might have stayed there, and I go up and back. But as for the future of Zionism, well, Zionism changed. In 1948, political Zionism, which became Zionism. So the former anti-state tendencies were absorbed into the state. From then on, it's just another state in the international system, behaving like every other state. Particularly after 1967, with the conquests, it became an appendage of the United States. So it's now the 51st state. That's not quite accurate because it gets far more federal subsidies than any state of the first 50. So it's an outpost of U.S. power. And there's a complicated arrangement. Israel's become part of the United States took over from Britain domination of the Middle East in 1945 as it took over domination of South America. And part of the system is that they're kind of local gendarmes. What the Secretary of Defense once called local cops on the beat. You know, whereas the police headquarters are in Washington, Israel's one of them. So it's part of the huge system which extends from the Pacific to the Azores that's aimed at the Middle East and controlling the oil, the oil system.
O futuro do
future
judaísmo.
of Judaism? Well, people's future is in their own hands. You can't predict tomorrow's weather. You can't predict things like the course of civilization. If you look at Israel itself, it's very sharply split in many ways. I mean, there's Arab there's roughly half the population is from the Arab countries, half from Europe. There's a very sharp split on religious lines, close to a civil war, you know. In fact, if you read the Israeli press, as I do regularly, you can read stories now in the major press, the leading press, warning of the dangers of a military coup with religious elements in the officer corps. They're concerned about that. There's very sharp, the last elections were a very sharp cultural split, and it's hard to predict the outcome. In the diaspora, say in the United States, which I know best, there's a very high level of assimilation. But at the very same time, there's a return to something like a slightly fictionalized version of the 17th and 18th century in Eastern Europe, which is drawing in hundreds of thousands of people. And you find both. Human affairs are a complicated business. I wouldn't try to predict.
Professor Chomsky, as opiniões sobre globalização e nova ordem, majoritariamente têm se dividido em dois tipos. Os eufóricos, que vibram com este novo modelo de desenvolvimento dos povos, dos países, e os conformados, que criticam esse modelo, mas que consideram-no inevitável. Na sua opinião, o senhor, que é um dos grandes críticos da globalização, há alternativa para os povos fora desse caminho? Há a possibilidade de um outro modelo de organização da sociedade em resposta à globalização, como no passado, por exemplo, houve modelo de uma sociedade não capitalista? Há algum modelo alternativo à globalização e à nova ordem mundial?
Well, first of all, globalization in itself is neither good or bad. It depends what form of globalization it is. The kind of globalization that brings people together around the world is wonderful. I'm all in favor of it. The kind of globalization that transfers power into the hands of what the business press sometimes calls a de facto world government of international financial institutions that represent transnational corporations and their local affiliates. That's bad. That's harmful to all the people in the world. So the question is what form globalization takes. Incidentally, about globalization and its inevitability, one has to be rather cautious to distinguish doctrine from reality. If you measure trade flows or investment and so on, the level of globalization of the world is not dramatically different than it's been in the past. There are differences, but not dramatic and not in scale. And furthermore, most of the interactions are internal to the rich, developed countries. So most of it is, about 75% is internal to Europe, Japan, and the United States. And the form that it takes depends on what people do with it. You can have a very constructive form of globalization in which there's cultural interchange, economic interchange, vital connections developing among people. But, or you can have a kind which is going to turn the world into a kind of Brazil. Brazil's kind of an extreme case with two radically different countries, one small, wealthy country that's part of the international elite and another huge country that's, you know, somewhere in Central Africa. The world could turn into that. In fact, that's happening in the United States and Britain and to a lesser extent elsewhere right now. But these are matters that are under control. There's nothing inevitable about them. There are no, these are not laws of nature. They're decisions in human institutions, and they can be changed like all others. What kind of a world could there be? There could be a world of greater freedom and justice. I have my own views about what it should be like. I think I'm an old-fashioned anarchist, as I was when I was 10 years old. I think the world order ought to be based on mutual and voluntary association wherever people are together. That means workers' control in the workplace, community control, voluntary associations, federal arrangements among freely interacting groups, crossing borders easily. There's nothing special about borders. And I think a world like that is entirely feasible, but it means eliminating concentrations of power. Right now, power is actually concentrating. Democracy is declining, and that's something I think that we should be struggling against. But it's not inevitable, and it's not a law of history, and if you look over history, it's gone all ways. There have been victories for freedom, there's been extensions of democracy, there have been contractions. We happen to be in a period of contraction, but that'll change as it has before.
Mr. Chomsky, mas o que o senhor pensa do marxismo? O marxismo ainda tem alguma contribuição a dar para essas novas transformações que o senhor está dizendo, que o senhor está afirmando?
The concept of Marxism is one that I find troublesome. In physics, for example, there's nothing like Einsteinism, because Einstein isn't a god who you worship. Rather, he's a human being who had important things to say, and like every other human being, made mistakes. So you learn from what he had to say, and you disregard his mistakes. Now, Marxism, the concept, in my view, belongs to the history of organized religion. It's a kind of worship of an individual that makes no sense. If you look at Marx himself and other people who've been working in that tradition, you learn what's valuable, you disregard what's wrong. And then after that, we just go and look. So, for example, take, say, socialism. Marx had almost nothing to say about it. I mean, if you read, I'm not a great Marx specialist, but as far as I understand, and I've read a fair amount, there are a few scattered sentences in Marx's writings about socialism. He's a theorist of capitalism. He was a theorist, basically, of 19th century capitalism, perfectly naturally. And he developed a sort of an abstract model of the capitalist system and its properties, from which I think there's a lot to learn. How much any intelligent person should read it and learn what you can from it, as you learn from others. To assume that it offers a doctrine for today makes no sense. I can't imagine that Marx would have believed that. He also wrote important things about the contemporary affairs, for example, about the British in India. Certainly worth reading, but if we were still repeating those things now, civilization would be dead. We should have learned something in the last 100 years. Yes, there's contributions, as there is from the rest of our cultural tradition. And you learn from them what's important, and you disregard what's not useful.
Professor.
Yeah.
Eu queria saber como o senhor avalia a possibilidade de o fortalecimento político internacional de países como China, Índia e Brasil e o crescimento econômico que tem sido registrado nesses países, de alguma forma poderem de alguma forma ameaçar a nova ordem mundial?
Well, first of all, I think we should be careful when we refer to a country, like, say, India or China or Brazil, we should recognize that that's a very high-level abstraction. Brazil is not an entity in the international order, nor is India. So in India, there's a section that's developing, and there's a huge sector that's either stagnating or probably declining. Actually, I was there not long ago and saw both sides of it. When you talk about the growth in India, again, be cautious. When the neoliberal reforms were instituted in India, there was, as almost always, a very sharp decline and collapse. That's pretty regular. Then there's a recovery from the collapse. So if you read the Wall Street Journal, they'll talk about the wonderful growth, but they'll start from the period of recovery, go back 10 years, and you find that the growth during this period is actually lower than it was before. But it's highly concentrated, and it's also multinational. So India has opened itself to foreign penetration, meaning primarily U.S. corporations. And it's interesting the way they did it. The first thing they did was take over the advertising industry. So what you see advertised is foreign goods, which the purpose is to undercut domestic manufacture, to get people tied to foreign imports. Now, there are sectors of Indian society that are benefiting from this, living much better than they did before. There are other sectors that are suffering. The same is true in China. China is very sharply split. Parts of China are developing. Other parts are devastated, enough so that many China scholars fear a possibility of the return to the peasant wars of the past period. Even if you look at things like, just say, mortality rates, you find that the general health system improved quite sharply until about 1979. Then it started leveling off, and most recent statistics I've seen, it may even be declining. That's parallel to huge growth, you know, the yuppies you see on CNN television and so on and so forth. They're two different Chinas. How will that affect the New World Order? Well, it depends what the world order is. If the world order is run by transnational elites in their own interest, with most of the population marginalized, it'll fit fine. If it's a world order based on popular democracy and freedom and justice, it'll break down the structures that are developing in China and India, just as it will break down the structures in Brazil.
Mas essas elites locais não seriam, ou não poderiam vir a se associarem de uma maneira a intercambiarem produtos, serviços e protegerem seus mercados, porque são grandes mercados e podem vir a interessar uns aos outros, a alguns desses países entre si. Quer dizer, isso não pode ser uma proteção contra o que seria essa elite internacional, basicamente do que seria o norte?
Same is true in the North. What's NAFTA? The North American Free Trade Agreement. It's a highly protectionist agreement instituted by the United States and associated elites in Mexico and Canada, directed against the populations of their own countries, all three, and also against Europe and Japan, which a large part of if you look at the NAFTA long treaty, about 10% of it consists of what are called rules of origin requirements, meaning that you have to have a high degree of a percentage of production within the North American area to be able to export. That's just a protectionist weapon against Europe and Japan. The United States would like to incorporate parts of South America within a protectionist trade bloc. East Asia has interests in doing the same thing. Europe is doing the same thing. I mean, they're all, on the other hand, these are not just at war. I mean, the linkages among the international corporations in Europe, Japan, the United States now, also the East Asian growth areas and some in Brazil, they're very tight linkages, and they're transnational. So there are lots of complicated things happening all at once, but the major tendency right now is towards transfer of power to private tyrannies and away from the public sphere. And that's very dangerous. It's happening in particular countries at different rates. It's happening internationally. And I think that's going to be very harmful to values that we ought to share, like democracy, for example.
Professor, eu queria voltar um pouco ao passado na linha do que o professor Sábio está dizendo. Após a Guerra Fria, quer dizer, houve uma mudança na política externa americana no sentido de não mais temer o inimigo interno. E, por outro lado, criou-se, principalmente nos militares, e o Brasil foi usado como uma espécie de laboratório, na questão da segurança nacional, ou seja, a volta para dentro do país. O senhor teve acesso a documentos secretos no governo americano que contam um pouco desse nosso período aqui no Brasil. Como é que o senhor analisa esse período? Que informações o senhor tem sobre isso?
Oh, there's plenty of documents. The United States is quite an open society, and one of the good things about it is you have fairly good access to the record of secret planning, maybe 30 or 40 years ago, but sometimes even pretty recent. Incidentally, I do not think that U.S. foreign policy changed dramatically after the Cold War. If you look at, say, pick any issue, Middle East, Cuba, Panama, it's all the same. Nothing much changed. Some changes, but the policies were not guided by fear of the Soviet Union. That was a pretext, and you can see it very clearly by the fact that the policies continue, but with a different pretext. So in the case of Cuba, for 30 years, the pretext was danger of the Soviet Union. Right after the Cold War, what happens? The policies get harsher. But now they're, because all of a sudden the United States loves democracy, so next there'll be some other pretext. So I don't think the policy's changed. With regard to Brazil, we know the record pretty well. In the late 1950s, the Eisenhower administration began to propose a strengthening of the Latin American military and a shift in their mission, which is largely determined in the United States. It proposed a shift which was finally, it couldn't be instituted at the time. Congress wouldn't accept it, but it was instituted under Kennedy. In 1962, the Kennedy administration shifted the mission of the Latin American military from hemispheric defense, which is kind of a holdover from World War II, to what they called internal security, which is just a technical term, which means war against their own populations. And the Brazilian military coup, in fact, shortly after, was one of the first examples of this. Very warmly welcomed in the United States, even publicly. You don't have to go to secret documents for that. Publicly welcomed by the Kennedy people. I mean, Kennedy had been killed by then, but by his Lincoln Gordon, Robert McNamara, the rest, greatest victory for freedom in the mid-20th century, and so on. Brazil's a big country and had a domino effect. It sort of spread through the hemisphere right into Central America in the 80s. Enormous plague of repression, unique in the history of this very bloody continent. And it devastated many popular organizations. It set the basis for the kinds of policies that are now being pursued. And yes, you can trace it right back to the shift in the mission of the military. The Brazilian military were called an island of sanity in Brazil, and their takeover was very warmly welcomed. Brazil became what the business press called the Latin American darling of the business community. Meanwhile, we know, I don't have to mention what happened to the population, but a sector benefited. And so it remained until the late 1980s, very high growth rate, splitting into two completely separate countries. All of this warmly welcomed in international financial circles. And yes, you can trace it to, we don't have the records for recent years, but we have them from the early 60s, and they're pretty clear. The most important ones, I suppose, are from about 1966. They've been available for some years. These are discussions within among the Kennedy intellectuals. McNamara was Secretary of Defense, with George Bundy, the National Security Advisor. And they discussed the developments in Brazil. This is 2 years after the coup. It was a great success. They argue that within what they call the Latin American cultural context, it is necessary for the military to overthrow civilian governments when, in their judgment, the civilian governments are not acting in the interests of the nation. And the interests of the nation are then described very explicitly in terms that you would think come from a Maoist tract, referring quite openly to the revolutionary struggle for power among the conflicting classes in Central America and the need to improve the investment climate and so on. Very frank, this internal discussion, and the military takeover had indeed contributed to that, so it was warmly welcomed. Shortly after, you have the overt U.S. support for the overthrow of the Allende government, and then on through the atrocities in Central America and so on. Other respect, none of this had anything to do with the Russians. I mean, how many Russians were there in Brazil in 1964? In fact, the Russian influence actually the Russians were supporting the Argentine generals. They were one of their leading trading partners. Of course, everything was, for the American population, the U.S. population, the Russian threat was always waived. That's the way you control people, you frighten them. But in the United States, in reality, it's a joke. There's no Russian threat in the Western Hemisphere. The Russians were much more threatened in Western Europe than the United States was in the Western Hemisphere.
Professor Chomsky, em 1967, o senhor publicou um artigo, um ensaio polêmico chamado Os Novos Mandarins, em que o senhor apontava a responsabilidade dos intelectuais americanos que trabalhavam atrás da política externa americana. O senhor se acha que nesses últimos 30 anos os intelectuais americanos ficaram mais ou menos responsáveis?
When we talk about intellectuals, it's like talking about countries. We have to distinguish. There are those who are called the responsible intellectuals, namely the ones who more or less serve power, and there are those who are the dissident intellectuals, who are outside the framework of the power system and don't serve it. There are intellectuals of all kinds. There have been, as far as recorded history goes. Go back to the Bible, you find the same distinction. Those in recent years, it's hard to say. There's been a big change in the United States since the 1960s. there was a large-scale cultural change. The ferment of the 1960s led to just a change in the general society, and the freeing up of the society. So there's it's a much more open society than it was, say, 40 years ago. There's much more concern for issues of racial oppression, of the rights of women became an issue, environmental issues, solidarity with the third world. All of these things changed, and they've affected the whole country. In fact, activism was greater in the 1980s than it was in the 1960s, and much more deeply rooted in American society. And among the people involved in this are those who you call intellectuals. What does that mean? That means people who are privileged enough to be able to devote a substantial part of their effort to the work of the mind. And for some of them, that means to working with people who are struggling for a better life, for freedom, for human rights. For others, it means serving power. So it's always been. So, but the society is different, and in many ways much more healthy.
Daniel.
O senhor tem dito em várias entrevistas que acha que a democracia está sofrendo uma ofensiva no mundo inteiro hoje, que o neoliberalismo seria essa ameaça à democracia. Mas o senhor não diria também que o que a gente poderia chamar de capitalismo de consumo foi justamente o que levou as pessoas do leste europeu, por exemplo, a lutarem por regimes democráticos e pelo fim do socialismo?
First of all, there was never anything remotely like socialism in Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, the countries called themselves socialist and democratic. Remember, these were people's democracies. The West ridiculed the claim to democracy, but it loved the claim to socialism because that's a way of defaming socialism. But in fact, they were about as socialist as they were democratic. I don't think that the driving factor in Eastern Europe was a search for consumption. In fact, consumption levels have reduced very sharply in Eastern Europe since the end of the Cold War. The search was for freedom, which is fine. They were struggling for freedom and democracy. What they got was a return to the third world in most parts of it. As for the first part of your comment, yes, I think that what's called neoliberalism is an attack on democracy and is an open attack on democracy. It's not secret. The goal is to minimize the state. And if you minimize the state, you're maximizing something else. What is the thing that you're maximizing? Well, private tyranny. The state is the arena within which the public has some role, at least in principle, in determining policy. In the private sector, it has no role. So the more that the public arena is minimized and private power is maximized, the less you have democracy. Now, personally, in my view, the state is an illegitimate institution, should be dismantled, but not as long as private power is there, because that's much worse. That's a system which is unaccountable to the public. And the main thrust of neoliberalism is precisely that. It's to restrict the arena within which the public can make some difference.
Mas o que o senhor propõe? O que o senhor propõe?
My suggestion is to extend the public arena, and in the classic fashion, namely, as I said before, working people should have control of the places in which they work, not private tyrants. The people of a community should have control of their community, and they should interact with one another. That increases the public sphere. If the heavy concentration of private power is eliminated, then I think moves towards dismantling the entire state system are entirely legitimate, proper. But you face the world that you're in right now. Incidentally, these neoliberal moves are not moves towards establishing a market system. A private corporation is outside the market system. If you look at world trade, take, say, the United States, about half of U.S. trade is not trade at all. It's just transactions internal to a corporation run by a very visible hand, which just happen to cross borders. So half of U.S. exports to Mexico don't even enter the Mexican economy. They're just parts are being assembled in the United States, transferred to Mexico to another branch of, say, the same Ford Motor Company. It's called exports. They come back to the United States, called imports. That's not trade, that's mercantilism. And that's a huge part of world trade. It's kind of corporate mercantilism in which the market is functioning only at the margins and functioning mostly to control people. The ones who are running the world economy have protected themselves very strongly from market discipline. In fact, if you look at the top, there are some good studies by good economists of transnational corporations. And there's one major study by two British economists of the top 100 transnational corporations. Every one of them has benefited from the interventionist policies of its home government, and 20 of the 100 have been saved from complete collapse by state takeover and bailout. Over and above that, the corporation itself is out of the market system. Its internal transactions are centrally directed. These are command economies. So you have the neoliberal system is an attack, in my view, both on the market and on democracy.
Professor Chomsky, o senhor disse que apesar de tudo que o senhor mencionou anteriormente, a opinião pública mais informada, a maior solidariedade, há uma deterioração da democracia nos Estados Unidos. Como é que é possível haver todos os elementos de avanço e, no entanto, haver uma deterioração democrática?
Well, the world's a complicated place. There's a very clear class struggle. Those who own and direct the society and manage it would naturally fear democracy, and they'll use what measures they can to restrict it. One measure is restricting the public arena. Another measure is massive propaganda. The United States has a huge public relations industry, which for most of this century has been dedicated to what its own leaders call controlling the public mind, on the principle that the mind of the public can be regimented as much as an army regiments the bodies of soldiers. And the reason is, as they frankly say to one another, quoting in fact, that the hazard facing industrialists is the growing political power of the masses. So that has to be contained. You can't contain it very much by force in the United States. It's become a free society. So you control it by propaganda, by narrowing the public arena, by treaty arrangements which, like NAFTA, for example, which take many decisions out of the public arena. On the other hand, there's popular forces struggling to increase democracy. So the usual conflict's been going on for centuries, going on right now. It goes up and back. In the 1950s, for example, they were also declaring the end of history. It was then called the end of ideology. It's all over. We've got everything under control. Everybody's a passive consumer. Nobody thinks anymore. Well, a few years later, the country was in an uproar. That's happened over and over again in the past, and I think it's now happening right now. So, for example, the labor movement, which was under very severe attack, actually criminal attack in the 1980s, is now reviving. It's recognizing that the one-sided class war is going to lead to destruction, and we can't tell where it'll go.
Professor Chomsky, nós precisamos fazer agora pequeno intervalinho e a gente já volta já com a segunda parte do Roda Viva, que esta noite entrevista o pensador americano Noam Chomsky. Até já. Bem, nós voltamos com o Roda Viva, que esta noite entrevista o pensador americano Noam Chomsky. Nós lembramos, mais uma vez, que como esse programa foi gravado, nós não estamos recebendo as perguntas dos telespectadores. Eu queria aproveitar também a ocasião e dizer que a Editora Escrita está lançando esse livro do professor Chomsky, Novas e Velhas Ordens Mundiais. Bem, pouquinho antes da gente encerrar o primeiro bloco, o Dini estava tentando fazer uma pergunta para o Chomsky, que eu passo a palavra então para ele agora.
Obrigado. Professor Chomsky, a diminuição, o enfraquecimento do Estado significaria, nas suas palavras, e todos nós, o fortalecimento da sociedade, né? O revigoramento da arena pública, que o senhor tem usado essa expressão. E nessa arena pública, a mídia tem um papel fundamental. E o senhor tem sido o mais vigoroso crítico da mídia internacional, da mídia privada. Eu gostaria que o senhor também elaborasse um pouco sobre a questão essa manipulação da mídia, esses descaminhos da mídia, devem ser apenas atribuídos ao grande capital nacional ou internacional, interesses políticos, ou é a própria instituição que está precisando de ser revitalizada como serviço público, como espírito público? Qual é a sua opinião a respeito desse processo todo?
Mm-hmm. Well, first, to be clear, I think that the public arena is now shrinking, and I'd like to see it develop.
Of course.
So the minimization of the state is shrinking the public arena because of the extension of private power. Now, as far as the media are concerned, the major media in the world, say the United States or Brazil, are private corporations, and they're simply part of the private corporate system. They are very closely linked to they're huge corporations. They're linked to even bigger ones. In the United States, you can take a look at the major television channels. They're parts of huge mega corporations, closely linked to state power. The individuals who are at the high levels, the management levels, move very easily between the executive suite and state management and the editorial boardroom, and their interests are approximately the same. And they present a picture of the world that reflects their interests. They have certain goals. The goals are not hard to determine from the structure of the institution. They want to protect the nexus of state-private power that they represent that requires different modes for different audiences. For a large part of the audience, that means simply marginalizing them. For the media, and its managers, I think the social ideal, the ideal they'd like to reach, is a society in which the social unit consists of a person and the television set, no other associations, because other interactions among humans are dangerous. They might lead to democratic participation. But if you can, the more you can approach the ideal of a society based on the person and the television set, the more you can do that, the more you're free to have formal political democracy without the concern that it might mean something, because then the people will become passive consumers and obedient workers and separated from one another, and civil society will collapse. Now, for the educated elites, the media have a different function. For them, it's basically indoctrination, making sure they have the right thoughts in their mind. These are people who make decisions. And they have to make the right decisions for those in power. Within that framework, I think you can explain a lot of what the media do.
Mas e o papel do jornalista?
Mm-hmm. Well, I should say that I have quite a number of personal friends in the media, some in pretty high places in the media, many of whom are much more cynical about the media than I am. As a result of their own experiences. And they see their role as trying to work within the institutional structures to do what they can. And there's a lot that you can do. These are not military dictatorships. You're not going to be tortured and killed if you say the wrong thing. You may lose your job, but that's a small problem. And people work within them to press their openings to the limits, often doing very important things. Others are subordinated to the system. There are many journalists, well-known journalists in privileged positions, who consider themselves to be perfectly free, rightly. They'll tell you, look, nobody tells me what to write. And that's true, because they are so trustworthy that no one needs to tell them what to write. They've already internalized the values so completely that they can't even think other thoughts. So fine, they're completely free. Others who are more independent are less free, and are continually struggling against the limits that powerful systems impose. For the independent journalist, the goal is that of any other decent human being. Try to do what you can to help people inform themselves, work together, work for human rights, whatever your values happen to be.
Agora,
Professor,
senhor Chomsky, a propósito dessa questão, o senhor está recebendo um grande destaque na mídia brasileira. Como é que o senhor está se sentindo a esse respeito?
Perfectly happy to talk to anybody, whether it's the national television audience or people in a shanty town, you know, which I've done also. It's my own personal experience is not too surprising. I have much more exposure outside the United States than inside it. And part of the reason is views of the kind that I express are not much of a threat outside the United States. They're much more of a threat inside. So as soon as I cross the border, I talk to television and on national television and so on, but not inside. In fact, commercial television in the United States, surprisingly, is a little bit more free than public television. It's interesting, even though public television has the reputation of being more liberal in the American sense of the word, meaning more progressive. But that just means that they're more doctrinaire. They are cultural commissars. They understand better the limits of discussion, and they see themselves at the dissident extreme. You can go this far, but no further. Actually, public television is on record in the United States, even in print, saying they will not allow me personally to appear on the major news and discussion program. It's unusual to make such statements in print, but it's understandable. In fact, in my view, this article that you mentioned about the responsibility of intellectuals was primarily a critique against the sort of progressive end of the spectrum, what's called liberal in the United States. I didn't talk much about the right wing, because in my view, they are the real cultural commissars. I mean, they are the ones who are setting the limits. They act with a certain kind of dissidence, but a dissidence that presupposes the doctrines of power and therefore helps instill them better. And the smarter ones understand that and don't want to have anything that goes a little bit to the critical side. So this is the way institutions function. It shouldn't surprise us.
Professor Chomsky, por favor.
A crítica que o senhor tem feito à mídia é essencialmente uma crítica ao poder das corporações privadas. Como é que o senhor imagina um processo de controle social ou de democratização da mídia? Em outros temas, o senhor tem falado de controle social sobre as corporações privadas em outros terrenos da economia. Como o senhor imagina em relação à mídia esse processo de controle social ou democratização?
The media should involve popular participation. Actually, that exists. The model exists. I actually saw a piece of it, an interesting piece of it near Rio a couple days ago when I went out to the suburbs to Nova Iguaçu and watched popular television. There's an NGO that provides equipment mainly and some technical support for popular groups that do their own television. They write the scripts, they show the programs, they act, the people gather in a public square and watch it, they discuss it and so on. Well, that's a form of public media. In the United States, communities, there's a fairly substantial network of community-supported radio. That means small, usually small radio stations, though they can extend over a whole fairly, a city, which are supported by the public. They don't have advertising, and they integrate the community. You can tell I travel a lot because I give many talks all over, and you can just feel the difference in a community that has community radio and one that doesn't. There's a kind of integration. People know about each other. They know what's happening. They even participate, and it gives a kind of liveliness and vitality and vision to the community that you find lacking when people are separated from one another. Well, that's democratic media, and of course, it's on at the moment it happens to be on a relatively small scale, but we should bear in mind that not too far back in the past, it was on a very large scale. So even in the United States, which is a highly indoctrinated society with a powerful propaganda system, it's a real business-run society, very free, but business-run. Even in the United States, in the 1950s, there were about 800 labor newspapers, independent labor newspapers, which reached about 30 million people a week. You go back to the early part of this century, the popular media, meaning based in ethnic communities or working class papers or others, were virtually on the scale of the commercial press. In England, it continued until the 1960s. The major newspaper in England, the Daily Herald, had more subscribers which was kind of social democratic, had more subscribers in the 1960s than the Times, the Guardian, the other major newspapers combined. It was simply overwhelmed by concentration of capital resources. And incidentally, the tabloids in England, the real mass media, they were kind of labor-oriented. I mean, a lot of nonsense, but labor-oriented. All these media gave a picture of the world that's quite different from the one that's oriented to the interests and concerns of ordinary people. And it was a different country then. When this collapsed under not under force, but under the pressure of concentration of capital resources, the tenor of the country changed. You could see the changes. That's the sort of background for Thatcherism. Well, that's not far in the past. We're not talking about some unimaginable utopia, but things that exist in part and have existed in larger scale before and can be created again. In fact, the new telecommunications opportunities are offering ways are sometimes being used to create them, sometimes very effectively. Take, say, the last Nobel Peace Prize that was just announced a few days ago. José Ramos Horta was here a couple days ago, who won it. This issue, the Timor issue, has been a major human rights issue for 20 years, but it's only come into the public arena in the last 2 or 3 years, despite many efforts in which I've been involved too. That's largely due to the internet. It offered ways of getting information to people around the major corporate media, which organized people and reached the point where in the United States there was enough pressure on Congress to impose restrictions on military sales. The Clinton administration didn't observe the restrictions. It had to evade them in some fashion. But that's nevertheless important. And Indonesian generals take notice when things happen in the United States. Well, that's new technology. And a democratic media can be reconstructed. And in fact, like any other system of private tyranny, whether it's military dictatorships or totalitarian rule or private corporations, it can be eroded and eliminated. These are not, again, laws of nature, just human institutions.
Professor Chomsky, que opinião o senhor tem sobre a internet?
The technology itself is completely neutral. It doesn't care whether it's used to dominate and control people or to liberate people. You could say the same about the print technology, radio, television, or the internet. The question of what it becomes depends on what people do with it. Actually, the internet itself, like all of the modern dynamic parts of the economy, was created by the public at the public expense. So it should be owned by the people who built it. That's taxpayers. The major legislation of the last year in the United States Congress handed over this whole publicly created system to private mega corporations. That's what happened with radio back around 1930, when the free public spectrum was handed over to private corporations. Happened with television about 1950. There's an effort now, just passed in the legislation, to commercialize the telecommunications system, which was all created at public expense. That's who put up the satellites, that's who paid for the computers, that's who developed the technology and so on. Whether that'll succeed or not, we don't know. There's a lot of resistance to it. There are lots of popular efforts to maintain the internet as a system that is to which there's free public access and to which the public segments of the public can use for their own interests and purposes. The major corporations are quite open about what they would like to see. They would like it to be a kind of home shopping service, another technique of marginalization and isolation and atomization and control. But they don't have to succeed. any more than they had to succeed in the case of radio or television, or print for that matter. So the internet will become what people make of it. It has a lot of positive aspects. It has some negative aspects too. The communication through the internet does establish contacts among people who otherwise would be isolated, but it also isolates people. We're human beings, we're not Martians, and there's a big difference between face-to-face contact and punching keys and somebody else punches keys. And that has psychic effects, which I personally am a little bit skeptical about. So like most technology, it has a lot of facets to it.
Eu, pessoalmente, gosto muito da internet porque é o único meio da gente conseguir contatá-lo, não é, professor? A gente conseguiu uma entrevista no Jornal da Tarde e trocamos e-mails e tal, e realmente o senhor que anda pelo mundo todo só via internet mesmo. Eu queria voltar um pouco na questão do papel dos intelectuais. Alguns críticos da sua obra, professor, dizem que elas não atingem aqueles oprimidos que o senhor próprio defende, né? O senhor também é um crítico dos intelectuais, dos papéis dos intelectuais. E sociólogos, principalmente sociólogos franceses, vou citar aqui o Alain Touraine, que é amigo pessoal do presidente Fernando Henrique Cardoso, também criticou quando os intelectuais chegam ao poder, né? E principalmente alguns teóricos dizem que os intelectuais, quer dizer, têm alguma dificuldade em se contrapor ao establishment, porque eles fazem parte na prática do establishment, eles saem das classes mais privilegiadas e, portanto, eles têm dificuldade, ficam com as mãos atadas na hora que chegam ao poder de contrariar esse establishment. Qual o senhor acha que deve ser o papel do intelectual e como um intelectual no poder pode agir?
An intellectual in power should act to eliminate his own power. That's difficult, and it doesn't happen very much. But people sometimes ask me what I would do if I were elected president. And what I say is, well, the first thing I would do is establish a war crimes tribunal to try me for the war crimes I'm going to commit. And the next thing I ought to do is get rid of my own power and put it in public hands. Now, that's not done very much. Alain Touraine's criticism is, of course, quite right, very old. The first expression of it that I'm familiar with is by Bakunin, back in the mid-19th century, when he predicted that the rising class of what he called scientific intelligentsia, the intellectuals of the modern age, would go in two directions. Some, he said, would try to use popular struggles, say working class struggles, to gain power for themselves. They would become, he says, the red bureaucracy, which will create the most brutal totalitarian regimes ever known. Others, he said, will recognize that power lies elsewhere in what we today would call the state capitalist institutions, and they'll become the managers for those with real power. They will, as he put it, they will beat the people with the people's stick in the state capitalist democracies. Yeah, was a pretty good prediction. Then there's another group of intellectuals who usually won't even be called intellectuals, just people who are thinking, who are working with popular organizations, who are struggling against power, who are trying to diffuse it, who are interested in human rights and democracy and social justice and doing something about it. And that's another group of intellectuals. They need not have a high education, incidentally. I mean, I've known people who work with their hands who do much more creative intellectual work than many people in university offices. Whether you're an intellectual or not doesn't correlate with your position. And I think, as I mentioned before, even from childhood, one of the most lively intellectual circles I've ever been part of consisted of working people, some of whom had never gone through primary education, but had a very live intellectual life. Same is true of many others. Those of us who are, wear jackets and ties and look nice, we're wealthy, basically. We're part of the wealthy classes. We have privileges. And if you have more privileges, you have more responsibilities. And the question of how you exercise those responsibilities is a personal choice.
Professor, entrando um pouco nessas duas últimas questões, talvez misturando-as, na instituição a qual o senhor é ligado, o MIT, há um laboratório de mídia que reúne a nata dos pensadores da chamada Revolução Digital. Esses pensadores acreditam e defendem que novas mídias e novas tecnologias podem alavancar processos democráticos. A internet seria o grande espaço para que esses processos democráticos surgissem e crescessem. Mas me parece que esses processos estariam restritos a quem pode pagar pelo menos $2.000 para ter um bom computador. Como é que o senhor avalia essa corrente de pensamento?
The Media Lab at MIT is no different than the telecommunications system generally. There are people involved in it who are genuinely committed to making the new telecommunications media accessible and available to the general public as a method of democratizing the media, increasing information flow, allowing people to express themselves, to communicate with one another, and so on. There are others who are committed to making it a system of control and domination. And it's in microcosm, you have there the conflict that's extending over the whole society. Right now, the internet is an elite phenomenon. I mean, the overwhelming majority of the world's population doesn't even have a telephone. The number who have internet communication is very limited. They're usually part of wealthy, powerful institutions. And if you try to do it on your own, it's quite expensive. In principle, it could be democratized. The technology is there. But I just mentioned the Telecommunications Act of 1995. That's a major legislative instrument designed to prevent the democratization of the internet by handing control over from the public institutions to the private mega corporations. It was kind of interesting that in the United States, here's an example of how the media function, this was not treated as a public affairs issue. It was treated as a business issue. So you read about the Telecommunications Act on the business pages. Of course, it's a major public affairs issue, but the framework of thinking is supposed to be, it's got to be commercialized, because that's the only option. The idea that it should be under public control isn't even an option, so we don't write about it on the front page. We put it on the business pages. The only issue was, how will it be commercialized? Well, those are some of the ways in which the propaganda institutions, which is the doctrinal institutions, shape options, shape thinking, so that the major problems aren't even visible to people. Very few people know that this happened or are aware that there were other opportunities. You mentioned the Media Lab. There are people there who know. There are people there who are in favor of it. You find both kinds.
Professor, o presidente Clinton finalmente anunciou no seu segundo mandato virar a América Latina. Ele não cruzou a fronteira nem para assinar o NAFTA, nem para ver as consequências do NAFTA. Qual o senhor acha que é a pauta que ele trará para o Brasil? O que os Estados Unidos, o governo americano, pensa do Brasil? E qual o senhor acha que deveria ser a pauta de um governo brasileiro soberano que defendesse os interesses do país a discutir com o governo norte-americano hoje em dia?
If President Clinton comes to Brazil, it'll be because you have good golf courses and because he'll have a welcoming committee which wants to discuss with him the best ways to establish control of the subordination of the Brazilian economy to transnational corporations. That's why I'll come to Brazil. He may say some nice words, but he's a representative of the business community. He's not an extreme right-winger. He's sort of a moderate Republican, roughly Eisenhower Republican, more or less, virtually indistinguishable from his opponent in the last election. What should Brazilians do? Well, it's not their government that's going to do it. I don't have to tell you that. What Brazilians ought to do is overcome the scandal of Brazilian society, which goes way back and is part of a major Latin American scandal altogether, a much more exaggerated form of what we find all over the world. The state is subordinated to the rich, who have very limited social responsibilities. The country is radically divided. I'm not saying anything that everyone doesn't know better than I do. Most of the population is simply out of the modern sector. That's scandalous. Brazil is a rich country, has enormous resources. Throughout this whole century, it's been called the Colossus of the South, which ought to be, a counterpart to the Colossus of the North. If it isn't that way, that's a problem that has arisen from internal to Brazil, of course supported by external factors like U.S. backing for the military coup. But the fundamental roots of it are right here. And unless they are overcome internally, it'll just get worse and worse. And obviously, the answers are not going to come from the owners of the corporations or the leaders of the people in the government, or certainly from President Clinton. They're going to come from people within Brazil struggling to overcome these horrendous situations. I mean, the fact that Brazil, after 20 years of some of the highest growth rates in the world, say roughly 1970 to 1990, much higher than Chile, the fact that after this it was ranked in the UN Development Report next to Albania, that ought to scandalize Brazilians, and including what it represents. What it represents is a disaster for most of the population, which is particularly dramatic because this is not Central Africa. The resources are there. The human resources are there. The material resources are there. It makes the failure to realize the potential even more dramatic than it would be in a country that's suffering real limitations, as many are.
Qual é a sua opinião sobre o sociólogo Fernando Henrique Cardoso?
I read his work when he was a sociologist and found it quite interesting and enlightening. That was some years ago. Now he plays a different institutional role within the framework of a system of power that he either doesn't feel free to challenge or doesn't want to challenge. You have to ask him that, I can't say. But the system of power itself is a very ugly one. So just to take one example, the policies of Brazil are very sharply constrained by debt payment. Well, the people of Brazil should not tolerate this. I mean, if I borrow, with regard to the debt, and all aspects of Brazilian policy are constrained by this limit. Now, with regard to the debt, there's two options. Either you pay it or you don't pay it. I think it's perfectly reasonable not to pay it. It's been paid over and over again. But suppose that you decide to pay it. Well, if I borrow money and spend it gambling, is it your responsibility to pay it? No, it's my responsibility to pay it. That means the Brazilian debt, if it's going to be paid, should be paid by the people who borrowed it. Are they the people living in the favelas around Rio? They didn't borrow the money. They didn't get anything from it. The money was given to the wealthy in Brazil, most of whom sent it abroad and enriched themselves. Fine, let them pay it. Let the generals and the wealthy pay it. It's not the problem for the people of Brazil. Now, if the government of Brazil is unable to face that issue, or to put it more accurately, if the population doesn't compel it to face that issue, Brazil has very few options. And a person who sits in the president's chairs has very few options.
Professor, qual seria exatamente, dentro desse ponto de vista, uma política adequada em relação às multinacionais? O que o presidente Fernando Henrique deveria agir em relação às multinacionais? Aumentar o protecionismo? De que maneira?
The choices are not in President Cardoso's hands. They're in the hands of the people of Brazil. He, as a person, he can't do very much. The constraints are very narrow. With regard to multinational corporations, or corporations in general, in my view, our attitude should be the same as it is to other forms of tyranny. In fact, if you look at the history of corporations, it's quite interesting. There's good academic studies by legal historians and others about the rise of corporations. And it's an interesting history, worth studying. The modern corporation, I'm speaking now of the United States primarily, but it's not very different elsewhere. In the United States, the modern corporation was created by courts and lawyers, not by legislations. If you go back to classical liberals like Thomas Jefferson, they were strongly opposed to corporations. In fact, early in history, corporations were public interest groups. So people would get together to form a corporation to build a bridge, let's say. at some point in the 19th century, early 19th century, they began to change. Jefferson, for example, the leading classical liberal in U.S. history, back around 1820, warned that the rise of financial institutions and manufacturing corporations would mean the end of democracy. De Tocqueville said the same thing. De Tocqueville, another great figure of classical liberalism, when he described the United States in the 1830s, he warned that the manufacturing aristocracy, which is arising before our eyes, that's 170 years ago, is the harshest in the world, and if they ever get power, that'll be the end of American democracy. Well, through the century, they got power. They didn't get it from legislation. They got it mostly from the courts. They got the rights of persons. They got the right of free speech. You know, they got individual rights. By the early 20th century, they were huge institutions dominating the society, not by popular will, quite the contrary. If you look at their intellectual roots, they're very similar to the intellectual roots of Bolshevism and fascism. They come out of Hegelian ideas that developed in the late 19th century about the rights of big institutions over individuals. Very similar roots. That's why you often had progressives supporting corporations, same progressives who were supporting what became Bolshevism back in the early 20th century. And in fact, that's not inaccurate. A corporation is a totalitarian structure. Orders go from the top to the bottom. You insert yourself in it and you take your orders from above and you hand them down below. At the very top, it's an integrated sector of owners and investors, banks, financial institutions, and so on. But really as close to the totalitarian ideal as humans have constructed. If you're outside it, you have, the only choice you have is to rent yourself to it, which is called getting a job, or to buy what it produces. That's information if it's media corporations. Well, and these are not small islands in a free market sea. These are huge tyrannies, now very closely interlocked with one another, tied to the states that they largely control, integrated across boundaries. The attitude toward them should be the same as to other forms of tyranny. Fascism was overthrown, Bolshevism was overthrown, corporate tyranny can be overthrown.
Professor, o senhor falou agora que o fascismo foi derrubado, mas nós estamos vendo aí no mundo o renascimento, o neofascismo em todos os continentes, surgindo com muita força e força popular. Na França, o caso clássico, né, que é a pátria do fascismo científico desde o fim do século passado, o caso Dreyfus, né? Mas o senhor não vê a possibilidade desse fascismo popular que está surgindo, a Áustria agora, de se juntar às grandes corporações, ou melhor, as grandes corporações perceberem no neofascismo uma oportunidade de ganhar legitimidade popular?
You're thinking now of things like Le Pen's movement,
Yes.
that kind of, yeah. Well, you know, popular movements can take many different forms. The very same social groups can struggle for freedom or can be a popular base for fascism. That's true of Le Pen. I mean, take, say, Hitler. Hitler was a very popular leader, maybe the most popular leader in Germany's history. The popular base for Hitler was, in part, you know, so it wasn't just industrialists, it was social movements which could have been struggling for, in other circumstances, were the most militant labor movement in Europe. Take the United States right now. The people who are in the right-wing militias, as they call them, you take a look at those people. They're the same people who were organizing the CIO 60 years ago. They're coming from the same socioeconomic sector. They have the same kinds of problems. Their lives are collapsing, their wages are disappearing, the world's falling apart. In the 1930s, they created the American labor movement and won many rights and advanced freedom. In the 1990s, they're a right-wing populist movement, which is very dangerous, is under the control of fanatical leaders, many of them religious fanatics, same popular groups. And they have, it's the same story as in all human affairs. How they develop depends on what they do themselves and what others do, others who, like us, who are more privileged to interact with them. That's always been the case. It's still the case. Yes, the popular groups could be a source of very dangerous fascism. They could be a source of major liberation.
Professor, o senhor é conhecido, o seu trabalho é muito conhecido, o senhor foi um dos primeiros a denunciar a guerra do Vietnã, quando isso não havia ocupado o espaço da mídia. O senhor denunciou a questão do Burundi, quando a gente nem sabia onde esse país africano ficava. E atualmente o senhor está engajado, e já há algum tempo, na questão do Timor. Essa semana que nós estivemos junto aqui em São Paulo, o senhor inclusive esteve com o Prêmio Nobel da Paz, o José Ramos Horta, que é seu amigo de 2 décadas. Agora, a questão é como ajudar, quer dizer, como o Brasil, que tem tantos laços em comum, se não tantos, pelo menos a língua, concretamente, como o senhor defende que seja uma campanha, vamos dizer, a nível mundial para ajudar o Timor? E que esse, aliás, é uma outra questão que se coloca para os intelectuais, quer dizer, existe uma análise muito clara dos problemas mundiais, mas não se apontam, por muitas vezes, soluções práticas para combater essas situações. Eu perguntei, inclusive, isso ao professor Ramos Horta, e ele diz, por exemplo, o senhor acha que é válido que haja um boicote governamental ao comércio bilateral com a Indonésia, por exemplo? Ele disse não. Isso precisa ser uma ação da sociedade e, portanto, os governos vão atrás. O que o senhor acha dessa questão?
Well, I'm perfectly happy to recommend very practical solutions, and that's what I do in the United States all the time. But I don't feel free to recommend actions to you. That's for you to decide. I do it where I live, you know. Brazil's role in this affair could be enormous. In fact, you can see how enormous it can be by just looking at the history. To the extent that people like José have been able to do things, it's because he had support of governments. Which governments? Mozambique, you know, São Tomé. I mean, governments of that scale. He didn't have the support of Brazil within the Portuguese world, former Portuguese world. Brazil is obviously vastly more powerful. The kind of support that Mozambique gave, Brazil could have given 100 times that much support. That means creating international forums, helping put the issue on the international agenda, gaining publicity, and participating in economic pressures. He has his own ideas about what's the right thing to do. I have mine. In my feeling is that the Indonesian generals are on the brink of a decision about this. They could go either way. One of the foreign minister 2 or 3 years ago, when public opinion was growing, said publicly that East Timor is a pebble in our shoe. Maybe we ought to get rid of it. The implication is maybe we ought to get rid of it. It's causing us too much trouble. The Wall Street Journal, which is not a very progressive newspaper, had an editorial called something like "A Pebble in Their Shoe," urging the Indonesian generals, look, it's not worth it. Get rid of it. It's just causing it trouble. Just this last week, the Far Eastern Economic Review, you know, the major Asian economic journal, had interviews with top executives. I haven't seen it yet. I was away, but José Ramos Horta told me about it, so there's a second hand. He told me that overwhelmingly they were recommending to Indonesia to get rid of the pebble. Well, pressure makes a difference. Now, the kinds of pressure that come from Brazil are different than those that come from the United States. The ones that come from the United States are obviously more important. It's the world dominant power, so we do it in our way. But those that come from Brazil are not small, whether they're threats about economic cooperation, political threats, public demonstrations. You really have to decide, judging by the Brazilian context.
Professor Chomsky, eu queria fazer uma pergunta sobre um dos mais longos processos de discriminação imperialista desse século. O povo cubano, com o segundo mandato do Bill Clinton, pode ter esperança de que caia o bloqueio econômico?
Again, the decision is in the hands of the people of the United States and of other countries in the world. If the United States has, after the fall of the Soviet Union, when you could no longer pretend that there was a Soviet threat, the sanctions against Cuba got harsher. And the effort to strangle Cuba increased in intensity, just increased again last year. Well, at the moment, most of the world is at least rhetorically objecting. So there are rhetorical objections to this, that is, moves to break the U.S. boycott. Now, if those moves succeed, if other countries begin to trade with Cuba, you'll see exactly what happened with Vietnam. In the case of Vietnam, after the Vietnam War, the United States tried to strangle Vietnam. It had already won the war, in my opinion. Indochina was more or less destroyed, but it wanted to make sure that it didn't revive. So there was an economic stranglehold. And it lasted until other countries just started disobeying. So most countries obey what the United States says. It's a powerful, dangerous country. But after a while, Japan just stopped paying attention, and European companies stopped paying attention. They began to trade with Vietnam to set up business offices. Well, at that point, American business started complaining. They're being cut out of important markets. And all of a sudden, actually over a short period of time, U.S. government policy changed. It suddenly discovered that the human rights situation is improving in Vietnam, so therefore we can deal with it. Actually, nothing had changed except that economic rivals were beginning to move in, and American business was complaining. That's beginning to happen in Cuba. In Castro's last visit to New York, the government wouldn't have anything to do with him. The media denounced him, bitter attacks, except for one thing. David Rockefeller organized a meeting of leading industrialists who met him because the American business world doesn't like the fact that Mexico is starting to become involved in the telephone business and Europe is trading and so on. Now, Cuba and Vietnam are not the same kind of thing. Vietnam, most people in the United States never heard of. Cuba has been the leading foreign policy issue for 170 years. Back in the 1820s, the United States committed itself to conquer Cuba. And I should say that was the nice people. That was Thomas Jefferson and so on, who said, yes, we've got to incorporate Cuba in our empire. They couldn't do it then because of the British fleet, not the Russians, but the British. By the end of the century, power had shifted and they could do it, and they did. Under the pretext of liberating Cuba, the United States joined the Cuban liberation and conquered Cuba. And since then, from then till 1959, it was basically a U.S. plantation. It's a deep-seated issue in the United States to reintegrate Cuba, to subordinate Cuba once again to the U.S. system. On top of that, the United States elites are very much concerned, not about lack of democracy in Cuba. They don't care one way or another about lack of democracy. What they care about is the social standards that have been achieved. It has very high health standards, very high educational standards. In fact, unique in the Americas. It's roughly at the level of Canada and the United States, which is pretty remarkable under the circumstances. It's a poor country, and not only a poor country, but it's under attack by the hemispheric superpower. And nevertheless, it's maintained those standards, and that's dangerous because it sends the wrong message. It tells people, look, you can do something about your own lives, and that's a very dangerous thing for people to think about. So there are many reasons why the United States wants to ensure that Cuba does not pursue an independent path, and it won't be easy to overcome. But the major question, I think, is roughly the same as Vietnam. If other countries break the boycott and enough popular protest develops inside the United States, policy will shift.
Sr. Chomsky, infelizmente o nosso programa está chegando ao final. Eu e o Sergio Augusto aqui temos uma curiosidade, uma pequena curiosidade. O senhor votou nas últimas eleições americanas?
Actually, I did. It was the day before I left for South America. In my view, it's a decision of sort of 10th-rate importance, but not of no importance. The two political parties are more or less identical, but they have different constituencies for historical reasons. So the people who vote Democratic tend to be lower income, minorities, women, and so on. The people who vote Republican tend to be richer, religious fundamentalists, just racists, other sectors of the population. Now, any system, whether it's a tyranny or a democracy, is going to have to, the rulers are going to have to respond to their constituency. So, Brazilian generals had to pay some attention to what's going on in the society. When you have a political democracy like the United States with basically one party and two factions, they throw crumbs to their constituencies. They follow the basic policies the same way, but they do something for their constituents and they do different things. Now that makes a difference. It doesn't change the world, but it makes a big difference if a 7-year-old child has some food to eat. So I think that's a reason for voting one way or another. Incidentally, I split my vote. So I'll sometimes vote for Republicans, sometimes for Democrats, but mainly on the basis of considerations like that.
Ok. Eu agradeço muito a sua presença aqui essa noite e acredito que a sua passagem pelo Brasil vai contribuir muito para o debate sobre o nosso futuro. Eu gostaria também de agradecer bastante a presença dos nossos entrevistadores aqui essa noite no Roda Viva, agradecer a sua atenção e lembrar que o Roda Viva volta na próxima segunda-feira, às 10h30 da noite. Até lá, uma boa noite para todos e uma boa semana.